three reasons. And those three reasons are to prevent and respond to the next pandemic. One, the international community and scientists in particular have a vested interest in understanding what type of laboratory research is done and what type of laboratory safety. Critically important. Number two, disclosure. The international community has a vested interest in disclosure occurring properly and within 24 hours if, in fact, there is a virus or bacteria that's released that could lead to a pandemic. And then number three, the ethics of what kind of research is done and in what laboratories, and if we have assurances that those laboratories and those scientists can be trusted. So my colleague mentioned that it was natural to have collaboration and to get information from various scientists around the world, and I would agree with that. Did you have collaboration and consensus and readily available data from the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Only what was in the public domain.
Dr. Gary?
Same answer.
Okay. I would also like to point out that when you have a phone call and 4 days later a paper is presented, and as you said, you're looking at data, when did you put the paper up submit it for publication?
17th of February.
Okay, but yet there was changes to that paper, or changes, as you both have said and stated within your testimony, that you got information which led you to believe that it was improbable or that a laboratory leak was not available. So it seems to me the paper was constructed and then sent for publication, and then data came out after that. So specifically, in reference to the paper, one of the referees said there are two recent reports about coronavirus in pangolins. The authors might want to comment on these. Dr. Anderson, you stated, we have included these references as well as several others that have investigated pangolin cov. In addition, we should point out that these additional pangolin cov sequences do not further clarify the different scenarios discussed in our manuscript. There is nothing in these reports that changes our statements regarding a potential role of pangolins. Then you also, a second referee asked another question that says, they're surprised that you did not hypothetically refute a lab origin. And once the authors publish their new pangolin sequences, a lab origin will be extremely unlikely. Your response was, our manuscript is written to explore the potential origins of SARS-CoV-2. We do not believe it is speculative. Unfortunately, the newly available pangolin sequences do not elucidate the origins of SARS-CoV-2 or refute a lab origin. Hence, the review is incorrect on this point. There is no evidence on present data that the pangolin CoVs are directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet, in your paper, you dispute and consider highly improbable, supposedly having new data and information, highly improbable that SARS-CoV-2 emerged through laboratory manipulation. I'm not suggesting that laboratory manipulation was deliberate or was a bioterrorism, but by your own statements, Dr. Anderson, it seems to me that you're actually saying that it's inconclusive whether or not this emerged accidentally or on purpose from a laboratory, or if there was manipulation, or if it came from science, despite the thousands of animals that have been looked at to see if it could have emerged. I think my time is up, and I think it's what we're finding today is that it's not as conclusive as you would like us to believe that it emerged through nature. Thank you, and I yield back.
Now recognize Dr. Barra from California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, Dr. Gary, Dr. Anderson, thank you for being here. Physician, faculty member at UC Davis, was an associate dean there, and I appreciate, you didn't sign up for this, but I appreciate that you're here. And for all the scientists, doctors, and others that work through this pandemic, some of the abuse and challenges that they've had to face, again, I apologize for that. As someone who has spent most of my time in Congress thinking about pandemic preparedness and global health security on national commissions, putting recommendations in place, traveling to Sierra Leone post the Ebola epidemic to try to get there, I understand how important this work is. I'm going to limit my comments to the topic today, which is proximal origin. If I go back to, January of 2020, when we first started talking about this, Congress had its first briefing I think in the third week of January in the CVC auditorium. At that point, I raised, and again, Dr. Fauci was one of the briefers, the importance of getting to the hot zone, getting our scientists, the best in the world, to Wuhan and to the hot zone to understand proximal origins. Obviously, that did not happen. So, there was appropriate criticism of how the Chinese were handling the early days of that pandemic. The scientific community did the best that they could to try to understand the origins, and I appreciate the work that was published in your paper. I appreciate the openness to thinking about whether origins were from a lab leak versus a wet market, and we continue to explore that. To my colleague, Dr. Miller-Meek's test, I agree with a lot of what she said. It is important for us to understand that and continue to try to gather information to understand it. But given that we may never reach a conclusion, I also want to be forward-looking. I think it's appropriate for this committee, because it is the vehicle we have as Congress, to look at lab security and lab safety and to think about recommendations, working with the scientific community, because this type of research is going to continue, and it's important for us to understand and prepare, not just for future pandemics, because we will see those pandemics in the future, but it also, there are biothreats around the world, there are bad actors around the world, and we have to be doing that research so we have appropriate countermeasures and the like. In addition, though, we shouldn't discount the theory that this emerged from a wet market, because we should also explore and work with the international community to prevent that type of leap from animals to humans, because we also know zoonotic transmission of viruses is bound to happen and is the origin of many new novel pandemics. Would both of you agree that we should be thinking about both of these, Dr. Anderson?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important that, there are several different objectives here. One is the scientific question of the origin, but of course, given what we have learned about coronaviruses, including the one causing the pandemic, but also all the related ones that have since been discovered, I do think we need to reconsider our lab safety practices around these viruses specifically. And that's because of what we have learned during the pandemic. And that's an important discussion, too, that I totally agree with.
Dr. Gary?
Well, we certainly, as virologists, take lab safety very seriously. The very lives of my students and myself and others working around the laboratory depends on taking those issues very seriously. And there are very good guidelines in place. I agree with Dr. Anderson that we need to rethink some of those, given the potential threat of wild coronaviruses coming over. We should probably do all those studies at biosafety level 3 instead of lower biosafety levels. But those are logical things that the scientific community will put in place.
Great. And again, I think that's where Congress should work with the science community and take guidance from the science community, as opposed to non-scientists in Congress dictating what might happen and what lab safety should look like. I also, just in the few minutes that I have, I would hate for this committee or Congress to conclude that we shouldn't be collaborating with the international community, having labs around the world, because if we want to prevent pandemics, we have to go out there where the pandemics are originating and work with those scientists around the world. And it would be a dangerous conclusion for this committee to say we shouldn't be working with labs around the world. We absolutely have to work with those labs. Thank you. And I'm out of time.
I now recognize Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both of you for being here to testify. I'm first going to ask, the same question first of Dr. Gary. In your documented emails to Dr. Fauci and others, dated before or around the same time as the February 1st conference call, both of you seemed absolutely convinced that COVID-19 was not from nature. In fact, Dr. Anderson, when you spoke to committee staff, when they interviewed you, you were very concerned about the origin of COVID-19 and wondered if you should contact the FBI or CIA about your concern. Yet, on February 4th, 2020, which was 3 days after the conference call, Dr. Jeremy Farah sent an email to Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins. It says, quote, "Please treat in confidence a very rough first draft from Eddie and team. They will send on the edited, cleaner version later, pushing WHO again today." Dr. Gary, is this the very rough first draft referring to the proximal origin paper?
It was a report that was going to go back to the original people on the teleconference. Were there elements in that report that we eventually incorporated into proximal origins? Yes, but it wasn't a draft of that paper per se. We hadn't even decided whether we were going to write one or not.
How much of, Dr. Gary, how much of that original draft do you think was included in the published proximal origin paper?
I haven't sat down and compared the two documents, so I don't really know how to answer that.
Thank you. Dr. Anderson, I have the same question for you. Was that first draft of the proximal origin paper on February 4th?
I think it's important to understand what our conclusions were in the particular
Sir, could
draft.
you answer the question?
Is that we...
Was it your
you can
understanding
see-
that it's the proximal origin paper?
This is not the proximal origin paper, as Dr. Gary stated. This is a draft report based on our discussion so far, and we conclude that we believe deliberate engineering can be ruled out with a high degree of confidence. But we also state that
That was on
evolution
February
scenario,
4th?
This is on February 4th.
4th, you thought
Correct.
that it could be ruled out, the lab.
No,
Oh,
not
deliberate.
the lab. Importantly,
Okay.
we talk about deliberate engineering. However,
Got
I
it.
want to point out that we also specifically mentioned that the current data are consistent with all three, meaning the three scenarios
All
that we
right,
described
thank you.
in the final paper.
Dr. Gary, my next question, you told Congresswoman Malliotakis that there was new evidence she said in the 3 days before your scientist team sent an initial draft of proximate origin. You said that that was not really the original draft, but had pieces of it. Is it normal for a scientist to totally change? Because I read your email from, I think it was February 1st, said, this can't be nature. This is, basically, I'm paraphrasing, too coincidental. This couldn't all line up together. To change in 3 days, is that normal?
So I think we need to step back a little bit from that one email. That was one email that I sent, amongst literally hundreds of communications with my co-authors, with other scientists, other people I was talking to about the origins. And in that particular email that you're talking about, I was doing what scientists very often do, and that is, take a devil's advocate position. So the questions that we were trying to answer is, could this have come from a laboratory? And I was taking that position.
Thank you, sir. I have 42 seconds
sure.
left. I have a very important question for both of you that I'm trying to understand. So Dr. Redfield told us in March of 2023 this year that either the Wuhan Institute of Virology or China itself deleted the COVID sequence in September of 2019. He also said that they turned over control of the WIV in September of 2019 to the military, Chinese military. He also said that the WIV changed the ventilation at their lab in the fall of 2019. If China wasn't trying to cover up something, why would they do this? Both of you.
I'm not a member of the Intelligence Committee. Don't have privileged information in terms of what was going on there. I really don't have any basis to answer.
But you don't think it's unusual for China to cover up things if nothing happened, if it was all natural?
Well, I'm also not an expert on Chinese politics, so I really don't have a professional answer for you there.
Dr. Anderson.
All of this seems routine to me. The fact that you have a BSL-4 laboratory getting their air-conditioned units upgraded, for example, seems unrelated, as the intelligence community has also concluded, is that is unrelated to the later.
How about turning over to military control or to delete the COVID sequence?
So,
is that just normal?
I have
procedure?
no comments on the first. I think it's important to understand that the deletion you're talking about is specifically about a database, not actually the SARS-2 sequence itself. And that database has been on and off and seemed to finally be taken offline in February of 2020, not actually in September 2019. Also, we know that this pandemic very likely started in the mid to late November 2019. So I think with quite a lot of certainty, we can say that these events are unrelated.
Well, that seems very unusual to me, and I yield back. Thank you.
I now recognize Mr. Mfume from Maryland for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the ranking member. I want to thank our witnesses who have endured us for the last couple of hours, and I certainly want to thank the members of this committee who continue to try to make sure that we stay within our own guidelines in terms of what we're approaching and how we are approaching it and what we, of course, hope to achieve. I've used this microphone and other occasions during this hearing to argue that we went through COVID in real time. Every day was different. Every week was different. Every month was different. And unfortunately, every year was different. And so there was a constant building process with building blocks about what we knew and what we didn't know, what we should do, what we should never do. And we came through that better as a nation because of the science which so many of us relied on, and the data and the approach that the healthcare industry took, particularly doctors and physicians over and over again, while many of us were free of that exposure in that sense. And so what we seem to do here is retrospective investigation, which I'm not necessarily opposed to, but I get the sense we do it with a vendetta. Like, I think this was wrong and you were the one that did it, or I think this was wrong and you conspired to do this. That's not going to get us very far, not at all. Given the critical role that science plays in advancing our understanding of emerging viruses, I'm appalled every time I hear some of my colleagues turn to politicizing and vilifying the researchers. Somebody had to do the research. Somebody had to come up with conclusions. Somebody had to follow the data. Somebody had to make an assessment. And so it's a little strange to me that we will vilify the people who did that at the time when we needed them the most, because now we're operating in retrospective lens. We in this subcommittee, Mr. Chairman, have attacked physicians, we've attacked labor unions, we've attacked public health officials, we've attacked teachers, we've attacked healthcare workers, we've really attacked the CDC and the NIH. We've attacked, as we've heard today, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, previously Dr. Walensky. We've attacked Joe Biden. We're in an attack mode instead of what I thought would be a real fact-finding mode about what do we do to get ready for the next novel virus, which could be set upon us at any time. And so in the 6 months that this committee has operated, I don't think that we've got an answer. I haven't seen what our steps are. If that's the case, how do we proceed? And if that is the case, we've got to rely on researchers and physicians all over again. And I think it poisons the water if we have already sort of predisposed who we think they are, why they are operating, what's wrong with them. The basic claims in the scientific article that we've talked about was developed to suppress the lab leak theory. It was somehow demanded by the United States government or else. That's an incredible disservice, in my opinion. We don't want to frighten off the very processes, the people, the industries, or anything else that will help us if and when something like this happens again. So I did not mean to get on a soapbox and make a speech. I actually have a few questions. I'll submit those in writing, if you would, Mr. Chair. But I just want to thank these two persons before us today and the others who have come before us and have had to feel like the weight of the world's been on their shoulders when all they really did was what they were supposed to do based on their profession, based on their desire to save lives. And as has been mentioned before, we followed other routines articulated by Dr. Burke, who was with Mr. Trump at the time, who said that we've lost millions of lives by doing the wrong thing, like recommending bleach and telling the American public, don't worry, come Easter, we'll all be in church together. And we were not in church together for another 3 Easters after that. I yield back.